Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into the state of modern global missions, and the research we've looked at, well, it reveals this really persistent and surprising tension.
What really does?
It turns out the biggest crisis that missions are facing, it isn't a lack of people who are zealous, and it's not even a lack of money.
What's fascinating here is that the greatest crisis is fundamentally structural. It's a deeply fractured system.
A fractured system.
Yeah. Our current approach, as the documents show, has kind of inadvertently created this very fragile architecture. We've elevated the individual goer, the person who moves overseas, to this level of, like, a spiritual elite.
Right. The hero of the story.
Exactly. While the absolutely vital support roles, the senders, the intercessors, the coaches, they're functionally sidelined. They're marginalized.
That's the core issue, and it really changes the entire mission. Our goal today is to extract the blueprint for building resilient, sustainable movements. We need to shift the whole paradigm, moving away from what the sources are calling fragile heroism, toward a model of faithful participation through something they call the missional ecosystem.
Precisely. And if you're involved in ministry or missions at any level, you really need to hear this. The challenge is so often internal misalignment, a misunderstanding within the community itself.
Not some big external threat.
No, not external opposition like persecution or cultural hostility. The research is fundamentally calling for a structurally aligned community, a system that actually reflects the relational nature of God, who is, communal by definition.
So let's start with the fallout. If the whole community is supposed to be engaged, but we only celebrate the person who gets on a plane, what does that actually look like on the ground?
It looks like isolation. In the contemporary culture, it sees going and holding the rope as these two completely separate acts.
Right, like two different jobs?
Exactly, when biblically they are two inseparable parts of the same act of obedience. So this imbalance, it means the goer is showcased, often in these glossy newsletters, and the sender just sort of fades into the background.
And that broken model, it produces immediate negative results, right?
Yeah.
The statistics show it.
They do. You see high rates of burnout, moral failure, and really shallow discipleship where people are learning to perform, not live authentically.
And what happens to the mission itself? Does the organization even survive when those people leave?
Often, no. Movements frequently fade once that initial momentum is gone. The research calls it death by insufficient roots.
Insufficient roots.
Yeah, the movement was tied to the charisma or the zeal of one or two people, but when they leave, the whole thing just collapses because the foundation wasn't broad enough.
I can only imagine the pressure this puts on the goer. They must feel this intense pressure to perform and justify their entire existence through, visible results.
Conversions, buildings, things you can count.
Right, visible achievements instead of the simpler but probably harder metric of just faithful obedience. They become performers for their funding base back home.
Mm-hmm. Constantly feeling like they have to prove they're worth the investment. And this fragmentation, it leads to a really severe deformation of the hidden systems that were designed to sustain them.
The church back home being a perfect example.
A perfect example. It's often reduced to just a transactional funding mechanism, just writing checks, instead of being the primary environment of formation and sustained long-term support.
But if the local church is just busy raising money, how does that physically prevent them from, say, praying well? I mean, doesn't the money allow them to hire people to pray or free up other resources?
That's a really sharp and practical question. What we find is that when the relationship becomes transactional, the foundational spiritual support also suffers. Prayer becomes optional, not foundational.
It's not the first priority.
Not at all. Without a robust, engaged, intercessory network, people who are deeply invested in the missionaries' health, not just their metrics, the missionaries bear this immense spiritual weight all alone. And their discernment suffers when making big strategic decisions because they're cut off from the communal wisdom of the church back home.
The sources make a really compelling biblical counterpoint here. They show that this fragmented model, it's not just inefficient. It's an actual deviation from the pattern.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about Paul writing to the Philippians. He calls them partners in the gospel, which emphasizes that they were inseparable in their obedience, even though most of them never traveled.
They weren't just sponsors.
No, they were active partners. It shows that holding the rope is an equally valid form of obedience as traveling to the edge of the map.
And we even see that principle of a shared load in the Old Testament, too. The research reminds us of Moses. I mean, he was overwhelmed, nearly collapsing under the burden of leadership.
And Jethro's counsel in Exodus 18, it reframes Moses' exhaustion not as a lack of faith, but as a system failure.
Right.
Jethro essentially tells him, look, what you are doing is not good. You will wear yourself out and all these people with you. You have to distribute the responsibility.
That's the warning sign right there. Your zeal can become a liability, not a strength, if the system around you can't actually support it.
We have to design for endurance, not just for the sprint.
Okay, so if the crisis is fragmentation, then the answer has to be a recovery of interdependence. We have to move from isolated impact to a true missional ecosystem.
That is where the breakthrough lies. The answer isn't to preach less passionately about going, it's to develop a much deeper understanding of God's relational architecture. The structure itself, the research insists, is meant to reflect the very nature of the triune God relational and communal.
So the mission moves forward through shared dependence.
Never through isolated strength. And this ecosystem, it doesn't eliminate distinct roles, it just redeems them. Goers still go, but senders, coaches, intercessors, marketplace leaders, they're all seen as essential components.
It reminds me of Paul's analogy in 1 Corinthians 12.
Yes. Neglecting one part, even the parts you can't see, it disrupts the function of the whole body.
And this isn't just theory, right? We have historical models of this cohesion working under immense pressure.
We do. The Moravian missionaries of the 18th century are cited as a fantastic case study. I mean, they were some of the most radical, enduring missionaries in history. They thrived because of communal discipline, not just individual piety.
So give us some of the details on that. What made the Moravian model work so well structurally?
It was the tightness of the support structure back home in Herrnhut, Germany. They had, for instance, round-the-clock prayer circles that were mandatory.
Wow.
They had robust mentorship systems where experienced leaders stayed deeply involved in the lives of the workers overseas. All of this ensured that workers remained spiritually nourished and operationally coordinated, even in incredibly distant and often deadly fields. It was endurance achieved through a shared intentional structure.
I see a similar blueprint in the Bible with the church at Antioch, right?
Yeah.
Specifically in Acts 11 through 13.
Antioch became, you could argue, the most influential missionary hub in the first century. And the reason is structural diversity and collective discernment. They had leaders from Jewish, Gentile, and African backgrounds, which was radical for the time.
And the decision to send Barnabas and Saul.
It wasn't a sudden individual epiphany, no. It was made relationally through fasting and prayer by the collective leadership.
Yeah.
The research just underscores that mission is always a shared endeavor that requires shared ownership.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because we hit this massive modern paradox. Never before has the world been so accessible. We've got cheap flights, instant communication.
Everything's at our fingertips.
Exactly. Yet studies show this alarming missionary attrition rate. I mean, sometimes between 20 and 50% leave prematurely. That is a massive loss of training and investment.
A huge loss.
And the research links this high attrition directly to what it calls urgency-driven sending.
That urgency often trumps wisdom, and that results in system failure number one, the rushing of the sent ones.
Rushing of the sent ones.
Yes, a major systemic failure that's rooted in what we could call the private calling myth. We've embraced this modern assumption that a calling is private, it's self-authenticated, and it's primarily emotional.
But the sources are stressing that biblical calling is fundamentally communal.
It is communal. It's affirmed and nurtured by the church, just like we saw with Barnabas and Saul in Acts 13.
And if that calling gets privatized, I would imagine it leads directly back to the isolation we talked about earlier.
Directly. The missionary goes out feeling like they have to validate their own private revelation, rather than resting in a communal affirmation. This leads to overconfidence and then severe isolation when the inevitable setbacks come.
They feel like they have no one to report weakness to.
Because the whole enterprise hinges on their personal heroic performance. The system prioritizes acceleration over preparation.
But God prioritizes formation over acceleration.
Precisely. I mean, look at the models. Jesus spent 3 years slowly cultivating the 12 disciples before sending them. Delay or pruning in that model is reframed as intentional preparation. If we want resilient missionaries, we have to slow down the sending process.
How do we do that practically? What kind of structured protocol should a sending church be using to test readiness, to distinguish it from just, spontaneous enthusiasm?
The documents outline a pretty clear 3-phase discernment protocol. First, there's observation. Leaders look for consistent faithfulness and fruit over time. Are they trustworthy with little things?
Right. Luke 16.10.
Then, invitation. The church extends a call based on that observed fruit and demonstrable character. It reframes sending as an act of recognition, not some transactional application that somebody fills out.
And third,
Third is testing. This is a structured process to prove doctrine, emotional resilience, and humility, the willingness to receive correction. So if someone needs correction or delay, it's not seen as failure. It's confirmation that they're still being prepared.
let's pivot to the second systemic failure, burnout. When we talk about that high attrition rate, we usually treat burnout as a personal character flaw, right? They weren't praying enough, they weren't strong enough.
But the sources reframe this so powerfully. Burnout is explicitly reframed. It is not an individual moral failure. It is a system failure. Exhaustion is a systemic oversight. It's a breakdown in shared responsibility.
Like Jethro and Moses.
Exactly. Jethro didn't tell Moses to pray harder. He told him to change the organizational chart.
And this breakdown, it often happens right after that glorious send-off, the commissioning service. The whole church is there. Maybe they raise their hands, there are tears, and then what?
And that's what the research calls the post-commissioning gap. That service frequently marks the end of intentional, structured church care. Initial training produces starters. Ongoing coaching produces finishers.
And the lack of that sustained relational care is the mechanism that drives long-term attrition.
We celebrate the start line, but we completely neglect the marathon.
So when the missionary is actually on the field, facing real difficulty and trauma, what are the symptoms of this care gap?
Well, the core symptom is isolation that's disguised as strength. The missionary, who is often praised for being resilient, finds that their self-sufficiency becomes their biggest liability.
So it leads to spiritual numbness.
It does. Prayer becomes mechanical, not relational. It leads to cynicism. They experience this deep disappointment that is left unprocessed, and it eventually turns defensive. They're still functioning, maybe hitting their metrics, but internally they're depleted and spiritually dry.
So the antidote has to be sustained relational care. The sender has to remain spiritually and relationally tethered to the sent. How do we institutionalize that connection?
It requires relational accountability that's built right into the system. It involves ongoing, coaching regular, mandatory check-ins, perhaps monthly, that track spiritual, emotional, and relational health, not just ministry statistics.
So it needs to be a space for lament, for processing the emotional load.
Yes, not just another performance review.
I love the practical suggestion the sources make about leveraging existing wisdom.
Yes, tapping into the untapped reservoir of experience. So many churches have retired missionaries or seasoned professionals who are just sitting idle.
Incredible resource.
A huge one. The research proposes building a coaching network of these experienced veterans to provide context-specific guidance. This not only reduces the isolation of the new generation, but it drastically enhances their resilience because they're learning from people who have survived the exact challenges they are now facing.
So what does this all mean? When we put it all together, the core insight seems to be that mission endurance is measured by the cohesion and interdependence of the entire ecosystem.
Yes.
Not just the number of goers we send or the visible results they achieve. We have to stop rewarding independence and start celebrating dependence.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this shift requires changing what we measure. We have to transition from evaluating organizational outputs, numbers, visibility, speed, to evaluating what the researchers call kingdom ROI.
Kingdom ROI.
Forget counting pamphlets or buildings. We're talking about measuring the health of the system itself. This means focusing on relational cohesion, spiritual engagement, endurance, and genuine humility. Healthy systems produce lasting fruit.
That alignment between theology and structure really is the key. The sources suggest that the highest expression of this interdependence isn't just shared prayer, it's shared infrastructure.
This is where the rubber meets the road operationally.
It is.
I mean, think about it. The most powerful coalitions, they overcome scarcity thinking by pooling their back-end systems. Instead of every small organization having its own HR, its own accounting, centralized security intelligence, risk protocols, they share them.
That operational synergy, it isn't just practical business sense.
No, it is kingdom wisdom made tangible. It allows ministries to operate beyond their individual limitations and focus their limited resources on the actual frontline work.
It's about building a better machine so the workers don't break. So here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. If you are part of a ministry, a church, or a parachurch organization, challenge yourself. Are there duplicated back-end efforts in your sphere of influence, HR systems, translation teams, security protocols that, if you integrated them with other similar organizations, would model this radical communal obedience and free up resources for the actual mission?